what genocide looks like at the highest level is a quarter of the population killed. In order to have a peaceful protest, it depends on your enemy actually considering your humanity. The Israelis, in their depravity, are actually filming what they're doing, celebrating it, taunting the Palestinians with it, turned off the electricity and let them die and then rot. They were next seen 17 days later. Several other doctors were kidnapped by the Israelis.
We are joined by Palestinian-Canadian Dr. Tarek Laubani, who has done a multitude of amazing work in Gaza, including his organization recently providing some life-saving work. I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Of course. So it's to my knowledge that of your times in Gaza, you've experienced a multitude of what I would call injustices, frankly. You've been jailed by the IDF. I believe you were shot as well and thankfully recovered, obviously. Can you speak to maybe some of those experiences and the things that happened to you while you were on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, the first time that I was jailed by the Israelis, I was quite young and I was working with a human rights organization, just observing. Um, I'll sort of zoom through the time of incarceration. Obviously, I was beaten, I was tortured. We were subject to a completely arbitrary system of injustice. But the thing that really stuck out in my mind, and the thing that I remember the most, is that as soon as I got out, I heard all of these stories of Palestinians who had been in jail. What I didn't know, I'm Palestinian, but I didn't know that 75% of all Palestinians under the age of 30 had already been in jail. And that, yeah, those numbers are crazy. At that point, I was in jail in 2003. The Israelis were still freely traversing Gaza. And when the Israelis would jail Palestinians, they would do horrible things to them. For example, one person I spoke to, when he was a kid, he was 11 or 12, he was throwing some stones at Israelis during the first Intifada, and some of the soldiers caught him and kicked out every single one of his teeth in his mouth. So we're really talking, when I was jailed, it was the tip of a really terrible iceberg that we're seeing now presented in the most difficult and callous ways. Because the Israelis, in their depravity, are actually filming what they're doing, celebrating it, taunting the Palestinians with it. They're trying to humiliate them by releasing video and photos and so on. And of course, the stories that we're seeing from the released Palestinians are completely consistent with the stories that I heard from my co-defendants and from people who had been in jail when I was in jail. People have no access to justice. They are abused. Things are used against them to punish them. For example, in our case, they used to almost refrigerate the cells that we were in. We were denied blankets, we were denied clothes, we'd be in our underwear. And if we behaved that day, then they would raise the temperature by what, half or 1 degree Celsius. And if they ever felt that we misbehaved, then they would drop it all the way down again, try to punish us with the cold. So that's a very small, very minor example. Deprivation from food was also used. Sometimes one time, one of the guards watched me eating, didn't like the way that I was eating, and so brought in basically a riot squad that beat me. Of course, they scattered the food and I didn't eat for that day or the next. And again, I am a Canadian citizen. I was stateless. I'm a Palestinian by blood, but not by any legal document. And so, as far as the Israelis were concerned, I was only Canadian and they treated me this way. So you can imagine what they do to people who they know are fully, as we would consider them, innocent. That is to say, they had nothing to do with anything.
Hmm.
Israelis, we now know, consider every Palestinian to be guilty. And we have not heard any stories so far of people who have been captured, who may have been fighters, who may have actually done something to the Israelis. So we can imagine that the conditions that they're subjected to are absolutely brutal. And if you sort of asked about some of the experiences, the other one was being shot. On the day that I was shot on May 14th, 2018. And that particular day is sort of at the intersection of the Israeli Day of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba, the Day of Catastrophe. That is when the Israeli state declared its existence, I guess, as it were, and where the Palestinians, I guess they were very much in the middle of their absolute catastrophe of dispossession, of massacre, of genocide, of all of these things. And so Palestinians were protesting. They were protesting peacefully. At this time, I still really believed in peaceful protest. And so the idea of Palestinians walking to the Israeli soldiers at the wall with their hands up, saying that we come in peace, that we do not intend to harm anybody, that we want our rights, I thought that that was a great idea. But what I realized over the coming months, even after that, is that in order to have a peaceful protest, it depends on your enemy actually considering your humanity so that they suffer when they see you suffer. But that's not what happened. When I was shot, I was in full medical garb. It was obvious that I was a doctor. Nothing was going on. It's not like, the Israelis don't take joy in shooting really difficult shots. They're taking pot shots. I was standing. There was no smoke. Nobody was doing anything, and they shot me. They tried to shoot me through both legs, and to a large extent, they succeeded in that, but they just missed the bone, so they didn't shatter what they call kneecapping, shatter both legs. On that day, 1,700 people were shot. And in the Great March of Return, in which Palestinian wave after wave of peaceful protesters walked with their hands up towards the wall, there were approximately 23,000 casualties, 5,600 people shot, of whom I forget the exact number who died ultimately. It's a crazy way to look at it. And so I think when we talk about my experiences, they really have to be in the context of the Palestinian experience. And of course, the luxury of the fact that when I was shot, the number two in the Canadian government called me to make sure I was okay. The Canadian government sought to evacuate me as soon as possible. I refused for ideological reasons, but it was my choice. The Palestinians who were more seriously harmed didn't have those choices. They weren't allowed out. They weren't allowed treatment. And so many of them ended up getting infections. Many of them ended up getting amputations. Some of them ended up dying as a result of their wounds.
And yeah, that's very interesting that that's kind of where you went with that, because I did want to ask you about the Great March of Return, because now you hear a large narrative kind of going around that largely reads Islamophobic, really anti-Arabic rhetoric, kind of where people say that like inherently that the Palestinians are violent, that they can't do peaceful protests and things. Which, as you mentioned here, this was kind of more of a mass mobilization of a peaceful movement, largely showing peacefully, which is something that Palestinians have tried to do numerous times throughout the years. And it seems that every time when they do, they're met with, like you said, as if they're less than humane response from the Israelis.
Less than humane is quite the generous description of that, of course. And I appreciate your generosity because I think that we are very generous when we talk about the Israelis and when we describe them. The Israelis have behaved basically like psychopaths over the entire duration of this war. And we've seen that. The whole world has seen that. But Palestinians have been witnessing that for quite a while. So, for example, when I was tortured in Israeli jail and I was telling other prisoners of my experiences, nobody gaslit me. Nobody said no, that didn't happen. Nobody minimized it. But it started them talking about their experiences, and I realized that every one of them had much more brutal treatment underneath Israeli occupation, both in jails and out of jails. So you're right that the Palestinians have been incredibly patient. The Palestinians have been incredibly generous. They gave Oslo this flawed, deeply flawed, doomed to fail peace process literally 30 years to work before they finally said, you know what, this isn't going to work. And I think that's the way that we have seen them kind of approach things. Because fundamentally, the way Palestinians think is humane. it's a form of humanity to think that your opponent, that your enemy cares about your well-being. And so very often when I would see patients, when I would see victims of the war, they would say to me, like, why would they do this to me? Don't they understand? Especially when children were killed, children, of course, it doesn't matter who you are, before I had kids or after. But when I would interact with children who had been shot by the occupation or had been killed by the occupation, their parents always ask the same thing. They always say, like, what fault is it of theirs? And I think that question comes from a deeply seated humanity. And that deeply seated humanity is what propelled the Palestinians to general strikes in 1936 with the British, that's before Israel, to peaceful sort of solutions in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And yeah, of course, the Fedayeen showed up. That's the people who fought with small arms. But by and large, Palestinian society was resisting through strikes, was resisting through peaceful protests. When I was arrested, they were running encampments along the course of this wall that was stealing acres of Palestinian land that was being built kilometers inside the border. And they didn't try to take up arms against the builders. They didn't try to blow up the walls, even though the capacity was there. Instead, they decided that they would try to deal with it peacefully. And of course, they were brutalized, just like I was brutalized. And in the Great March of Return, Gaza, like, there's so many guns in Gaza. Everybody's got a gun. It's like Texas, everyone's packing.
Yeah.
It's not that people didn't have guns. It's that they decided not to bring their guns. It's that they decided to make it peaceful. And when they approached the Israelis, they approached with their humanity in full view, holding it up with their hands. And then they got shot. So after that, I think any sane person starts to think, well, wow, this decolonization is not going to happen peacefully because fundamentally, the white supremacist or racist ideology that Israelis call Zionism, I guess we call it Zionism too, means that they will always think of us as unworthy, unworthy of life, unworthy of liberty, unworthy of peace, and they just don't care. The way that I started thinking about it after having talked to some Israeli soldiers, because I would go to Gaza through Israel. And so I would take the train and it would be me and a bunch of soldiers going for their duty at the border. And so on occasion, I would talk to them if I could stomach it. And I mean, I think that the way to really try to present it to you and to your audience is, what do you feel when you kill a mosquito? You know,
Not much.
I
Yeah.
don't,
You probably don't think twice about it.
a mosquito, by definition, a mosquito that's biting you is by definition a mother trying to feed its babies. None of
Mm.
us care about that. Now that I've told you, you still don't care about that. And realistically, that's the way that a lot of Israelis look at Palestinians. You have to do that. It's a society-wide shift in which the entire society is being trained to see Palestinians as lesser thans, or or to see themselves as better thans. And when you combine those two things, it shifts society in a way that's where it's really hard. Like, I don't know where we go from here. I don't know where Israel goes from here, because you don't go and squash Palestinians under tank treads while they're handcuffed and then be a normal person. Humans aren't built like that. So it's the humanity of Palestinians in the way that their resistances had to be for the occupation to continue, matched by a society-wide dehumanization. Yeah, sure, like Fanon says, it affects the colonizer, but I don't give a fuck about the colonizers. I'm not interested in the psychological damage that happens to the guy who ran over my brother with a tank. I'm not interested in that. But it's worth recognizing that it is happening.
Yeah, I think the analogy that I commonly hear is you wouldn't treat slaves who are revolting in the same way that you would look at the slave masters who put them in those conditions in the first place. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because a lot of the times when Israel gets caught or does these things, the one that my mind goes to first is them bombing the refugee camp in Rafah recently, is they always try to say, oh, it wasn't us, it was them, like trying to point the fingers anywhere else. And I was wondering if that's something you experienced maybe when you were shot by the IDF, or if it's something you could speak to firsthand of them, not wanting to take accountability until they absolutely have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they run through a playbook, and they ran through a playbook with me. So the playbook with me, I'll describe it as it happened with me, and then we'll talk about it in general because it's going to sound awfully familiar.
Mhm.
First, they said, well, he wasn't shot. And so people who were related to the Israelis, like their trolls and bloggers and so on, who had deep connections with the Israeli military, wrote blogs with photos because I released photos when I was in hospital. And they were like, "Oh, look, he clearly hasn't been shot." I mean, I literally sewed up my own legs. I spoke to a minister, a member of parliament, and I was looking at him. My leg was still bleeding at that point. The sutures hadn't come out. And he told me that he didn't believe I was shot. All I needed to do was lift up my pant leg and show him the inlets and outlets in both legs. And so the first thing they said is it didn't happen. And when it became really obvious that it did happen, then they said it wasn't us. They said Palestinians did it. Except that that was so ludicrous. The way in which I was shot, my clear memory of how the bullet came, a Palestinian would have literally needed to somehow make probably his way over to the Israeli firing position and shoot at me, like, get out of town.
Mhm.
And then they said, well, we'll investigate. And they tried to do an investigation. Well, who did they send to do the investigation? They sent soldiers. So I said, okay, fine. I don't trust the soldiers to do an independent investigation. But having said that, I'll participate. And then they refused to take my testimony unless I agreed to certain conditions, like never talking about it, et cetera, which I didn't. And so they canceled the investigation. But when I met with the Prime Minister of Canada, he asked me, do you want an investigation? I said, no. What I want is for you to, because I know that investigations are a waste of time and that it doesn't matter what the investigation says, you're not going to do anything to hold the Israelis accountable. So I said to him, what I want is I want money for hospitals in Gaza, which he promised me. He promised 15 million and of course delivered $0. So I think the reality is that the Israeli playbook is goes part and parcel with an international playbook where the Israelis cycle through their usual, oh, it didn't happen, it wasn't us, okay, we'll investigate a few bad apples, if it really had to come down to it. They weren't following orders, like with those guys who mounted a Palestinian on the hood. The Israelis said, oh, they broke protocol. I don't think so. The protocol is humiliate Palestinians, and that's pretty clear. Um, and then internationally, people give them that latitude. People allow them to do that stuff because if you held the Israelis accountable, it would never happen that I could just be shot, an international doctor, and nobody would ever be held accountable for it.
So I want to ask you about what you're hearing on the ground as to the state of hospitals in Gaza. I know I recently believe that Nazir Hospital, if that's how it's pronounced, was made to not be functioning. Are there many hospitals left in Gaza that are functioning, if any still are? And if there are, to what extent are those under threat as well?
Yeah, you're talking about Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis.
Hmm.
And Nasser Hospital, this is not the first time. Firstly, the Israelis, I forget exactly when it happened now, maybe February or March, basically said we're coming for Nasser, forced MSF, Doctors Without Borders, to evacuate from it, which, obviously is a terrible decision for MSF to have to make. But once they evacuated from it, the Israelis felt no compunction about going in. Palestinian doctors decided that they would stick by their patients because at that point, they still believed, because of their humanity, that the Israelis would treat them in some kind of humane way. Doctors like a good friend of mine, Dr. Usaid Sir, Dr. Khalid Sir, cousin of Dr. Usaid Sir, and and several other doctors were kidnapped by the Israelis, and we have not heard from them or seen them since. And the patients were killed where they were. They were buried. Mass graves happened. And when they left the hospital, they had totally razed it. They had just sacked it. I mean, I don't know what word there is for it. I guess sacking is probably the best word. It's like the stuff you read the Romans doing in prehistoric, well, I guess ancient historic times. So that playbook has been unfolded now through each of the 36 hospitals in Gaza, minus one. That one being the European Gaza hospital, which was just evacuated 2 days ago because the Israelis said, get out of here. Now, what will they do there? The Palestinians, of course, are not just replaying the same playbook. What they have done is they've learned if we leave sick patients at a hospital, the Israelis will kill them. If we leave doctors at a hospital, the Israelis will torture them and arrest them. And so they, as much as possible, evacuate everybody out. Now, when you evacuate people, they die. Not everybody lives. Not everybody survives an evacuation. But it is better for a Palestinian patient, deeply sick Palestinian patient, to die in the hands of their family while they're trying to evacuate than because the Israelis pulled the plug. So you mentioned Nasser. There's a hospital called Nasser, sounds similar, but a little bit different, which is a children's hospital. The Israelis, when they raided that hospital, forced the nurses out. It's a children's hospital. There was a unit of newborns who were on ventilators. Then the Israelis said, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of them. Turned off the electricity and let them die and then rot. They were next seen 17 days later. So, when I talk about the inhumanity of the occupation, this attack, I mean, it is beyond words and beyond description. And of course, you mentioned the refugee massacre or the tent massacres. We're creating new classes of massacres that we never imagined a year ago. Like, did you ever think of a flower massacre?
There's
I mean,
many things coming out of Gaza I couldn't have imagined before.
yeah, like we had heard of market massacres, sure, but flower massacre, now there's tent massacres, school massacres, hospital massacres, refugee camp massacres. I mean, it's insane. It's crazy.
Like you said, it's really hard to speak into words. It's also just as hard to hear spoken sometimes how inhumane some of their actions are. And correct me if I'm wrong on this part, but in the interview you did with Majority Report, I believe that you said you were working at Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the same hospital, obviously, that without evidence Israel claimed was a Hamas command center or something of the sorts before they then attacked it. Could you speak to whether or not those claims had any merit to them or not?
Yeah, it's funny because I think when had we spoken sort of 7 months ago, I'd have tried to make a case as to why what the Israelis said was not true. I would have tried to refute it point by point. At this point, everybody in the whole world knows the Israelis are habitual and pathological liars. And more or less now, all you need to say is that the Israelis were lying. And everybody I speak to is like, yeah, I believe that. But let's take it a little bit further, just to help sort of arm your viewers and listeners with a little bit of information about Shifa Hospital. Shifa Hospital was created a long, long time ago, before the State of Israel. When the Palestinians sort of started working and running it, it ran like a small hospital. It was a minor thing. And when the occupation started a complete siege of Gaza after the democratic elections of, I think it was 2005, 2006, they basically cut off within a year the hospital from everything that could come in, everything that could go out. And so within a year, everybody on dialysis was dead. Within a couple of years, everybody on chemotherapy and everybody who had cancer was dead. And the Palestinians understood that they couldn't count on anybody outside to do anything. So they started to build up this hospital on their own. That's the process that I entered in 2010. That's when I was a new doctor, just graduated. I started going there, I started teaching, started building, I started making. we started creating devices using 3D printers, and of course, training as much as possible the doctors who were there to get them up to level. By the time the Israelis came, the hospital was the biggest, most important hospital in all of Gaza. It had excellently trained doctors. Obviously, the equipment was lacking, but we were not far away from making uh, that lack of equipment not that important because we were working on ways to compensate for it using local production. And then the Israelis came. Now, Palestinian society is more or less evenly split between people who generally support Hamas and people who generally support Fatah. Think of it like the Democrat Republican split. It's more or less half and half. And if, for example, a bunch of Democrats decided to make the hospital into something, the Republicans would not stand for it because they hate the guts of the Democrats, or vice versa. And it's very similar with Hamas. If Hamas had thought to do something in the hospital, do you think I would have accepted that? And it's very hard to hide. It's very, very hard to hide. I had free reign of every inch of that hospital. And because I was basically solo there for a month at a time, when I was there, I'd go there 4 months of the year for a month at a time. I walked all manner of the hospital. It was the only way to clear your mind, to take a break, to find a quiet spot. I never found anything that pointed in that direction. And why would I? It's not like if you were a militant, again, remember, it's not just Palestinian unarmed protesters who have humanity. Even the Palestinian fighters are loaded with humanity. For example, how many Israeli ambulances have the Palestinians targeted? How many Israeli evacuation helicopters have they targeted? They're videotaping them every week. We're seeing video. So, so Shifa itself, there was no way to hide that stuff. They couldn't have hidden that stuff. When the Israelis came in, they had full run of the place for weeks, and they entered 3 times. They never once found anything. They never once did. They didn't even pretend. They didn't even claim to have found anything. They're habitual liars, but they knew they didn't need to lie about this.
Mhm.
And then, and then in the last 2 days, they released who they said was the ringleader, Dr. Muhammad Abu Silmiya. Dr. Muhammad Abu Silmiya is a good friend of mine, and he's a man who is visionary. He was one of the big reasons why Shifa could be such a high functioning hospital because he knew who could get things done. He knew how to make things happen. And so he was negotiating with the Israelis the whole time. And he negotiated an exit for his patients. And the Israelis betrayed him and betrayed his patients and arrested a bunch of them and took him captive, along with other good doctors, other friends of mine, other former students, current students even. Well, Dr. Muhammad Abu Salmiya was released 2 days ago. The other doctors have all been released over the last couple of months. What does that tell you? He was put in front of a military Israeli court 3 times, and they couldn't manufacture charges against him. And it's not like the Israeli military court is seeking justice, but they want at least a fig leaf of some kind of truth. And they couldn't manufacture a single thing about him because the man is clean as a whistle. Anybody who spoke to him for 5 minutes knew that. Anybody knew that. And so the case against Al-Shifa was a lie from the start, provably so. The Palestinians offered international observers to go and inspect the entire hospital. The Israelis refused. And then when the Israelis came in, they produced no evidence. And then finally, in the nail in the coffin of this case, is that they have released everybody associated with it, who they claimed at the time were super head honchos. Like the Hitler of Al-Shifa has now been released. Maybe he wasn't quite the Hitler you claimed he was. Maybe he was just a doctor, like all of us said all along.
And you kind of spoke to the threat that they experienced, but I'm curious if you could speak to, and feel free to go more in depth if needed, but the experience of doctors on the ground in Gaza, not only with the threats that they face, but I'm sure with the lack of ability to get supplies or equipment from Israel, having a blockade on all the ports of entry. How difficult is them to carry out even just their basic duties?
I mean, I can't say that they can carry out their basic duties anymore. Like They are functioning at the moment like death doulas. You know, they sit with their patients. They do what they can. There is some equipment available. But patients who are salvageable, that's the term we use in trauma, aren't being salvaged. They can't be treated. When I worked in Al-Shifa doing triage during previous wars, my duty was to stand at the front and decide which patient could go into the hospital and which patient was unlikely to survive and should be set aside to die. And I would say that it was generally about one third, two thirds. You know, because the people who are coming in are very seriously wounded. And it's not normal. And in Canada, it would be probably 5% in a mass casualty, who would be what we call triage X. They're going to die, expectant management. But in Shifa during a war, the people who are arriving are generally people who are very, very, very injured. And so, you know, it would be about one third, two thirds. Now, basically, my colleagues tell me that 80 to 90% of the people who arrive, they sit them aside and they just help usher them into death as dignified as they can. And a lot of that is because of how seriously injured they are. A lot of that is because of how sick they were before they got injured. Remember that people now have been without food for almost 9 months. Everybody's famine. When I see photos or video of my colleagues, I can't believe them. I mean, everybody looks like they've shrank, and they have. That's because they have. And the children, of course, people who are sick, people who are elderly, have fared much, much, much worse. So they're doing as much as they can. But even international teams, like we used to kind of have a bit of an exemption. We'd send in these international doctors and they'd go in with equipment and they would be able to do a little bit more. Now those international doctors can barely get in. We've been able to only get in three in the last 2 months in our group, whereas we were getting in probably 15 or so every 2 weeks. We can't get any equipment in. We were taking in between 300 and 400 kilos of equipment every 2 weeks. Now we're taking in 0 kilos of equipment. And and so it means that the care that we can provide is terrible. I mean, we're doing our best. Everybody's doing their best. But the reality is that it's an environment in which it's almost miraculous what they're able to achieve. And one of the reasons why they can do so much, to circle back to the humanity of the Palestinians, is because they believe so deeply in the humanity of their patients and they want so much to give them every chance to survive.
One of the more powerful questions that I feel like you were asked on the Majority Report, and I wanted to be sure to get your take of it on here as well, is what does genocide materialize like? Like, what does genocide actually look like and feel like on the ground for those who maybe have only read about it in history books or only heard the term in passing?
In terms of what it means to destroy an entire population, we're now in the terminal stages of that. Let's say if everything were to stop right now, we're probably looking at losses in the 500,000 range. At the very least, what we've counted is 100,000 people dead, or sorry, 100,000 casualties, 35,000 people, 40,000 people approximately who are killed, and then another 100,000 who are wounded. But the real number is much more. The way Palestinians count their dead is that because they know, like, brown people know, and I think you as a person of color also know, you're not believed. And so you don't make claims that you can't back up. You're never going to talk about how the police beat you if you don't have video about it, you know, or at least you're not going to try to do much with it. That's because
Exactly.
we're not believed. And so Palestinians, knowing this, aren't counting the dead who are under the rubble, who they know are dead. They know that these people are dead. They're not counting the children who are destroyed because they know, even though they know they're dead. They're counting the people they can verify who have ID cards. Even the unidentified people, they're not counting them. So, what genocide looks like at the highest level is a quarter of the population killed. You know, that's that's genocide. But the Israelis haven't been seeking just extermination. if they wanted to exterminate, kill Palestinians, it's one thing. But I don't really know what exactly is going on psychologically. A lot of what they've been doing has had to do with domination and humiliation. And so instead of just killing Palestinians, what they're doing is that they're depriving them of their dignity by, for example, stripping them naked, raping them with dogs, inserting hot rods into their rectums, their asses. And when they do such things, they're killing part of the spirit of Palestinians. They're killing a future of Palestinians. How do you, I don't know if you saw some of the video of some of the prisoners who've come out
Yeah.
who were perfectly normal when they went in and now look like they will never be the same. How do you go from watching, one of the top doctors in Gaza crawling on his hands and knees naked, drinking urine out of a bowl, to being a normal citizen? You can't. So genocide looks like trying to humiliate and degrade an entire population. And not only that, but there's also poison pills. And one of these poison pills is famine. The Israelis, a bomb is expensive, very, very expensive. And it creates all kinds of images that people are really interested in seeing and so on and so forth that prove your culpability. Famine, nobody seems to really care about. And so starving the Palestinian population creates two kinds of victims. One kind is the kind who dies, all of the young, all of the old, all of the sick, all of the feeble, all of those who just can't get in. And again, Palestinians have already counted dozens of deaths by famine, but they've only counted the ones that have arrived to the hospital, which are the most privileged of those famine deaths.
Mhm.
So that's one kind of victim. But the other kind of victim, remember, 45% of Palestinians in Gaza are under the age of 14. We don't even consider children under the age of 18. We consider them under the age of 14, right? Because again, they don't consider us children when we're 16. And so, to kind of make good with white people's evaluation of children, we're like, okay, well, nobody can argue that a 14-year-old is an adult. So we'll count them as a child. Those children are still growing. They're still in puberty. They're still trying to have growth spurts, and they're stunted now. For example, I'm 5'8", 5'8.5", something like this. My father's 5 foot. That's because right after the Nakba, they were starved. And so he was stunted in his growth. And my mother is the same. She's 5 foot. Also stunted in her growth because she was growing up during the same time period. There will be a whole generation of children who are mentally and physically stunted because they couldn't get the nutrition they needed to grow. And that is one of the other kinds of genocide that's happening. And then I think the other way the genocide looks like is by the elimination of all of the hallmarks of a society. So, for example, there's no university left. There's no school left. There's no hospital left. There's no art center. Why would they bomb the art center? Why would they bomb the concert hall? There's nothing going on in there. Like, artists are not the people who would do that. Why would they bomb the French embassy? Oh, it's not quite an embassy, but this like French cultural center that's staffed by embassy officials. I mean, every symbol of cultural life is gone. Music schools, gone. Like what? The flute is a threat to Israeli society. That's what genocide looks like. So genocide is so encompassing. It's so comprehensive that it attacks every piece of Palestinian soul and life. But it creates this space for resistance. So what does combating genocide look like? We talk about what does genocide look like. What does combating genocide look like? First, the most important way to combat genocide, pick up weapons and fire at the killers. Palestinians are doing that very, very well. They are destroying the Israeli army. The Israeli army is losing, and they cannot win. They will not win. So we shouldn't pretend as though the best way to fight genocide is through art or dancing or peaceful protest. It's not, it's through weapons. However, not all of us can engage in that particular way. So for somebody like me, I'm never going to pick up a weapon, as much as I might support the armed resistance. I'm not built for that. I am built for medicine. I am built for the academy. And so what fighting genocide looks like for me is thinking about how to rebuild the academy the morning after liberation. What fighting genocide looks like for the children in Gaza is flying kites with Palestinian colors. What fighting genocide looks like for the women of Gaza is having kids, despite everything that's happening. What it looks like for the men of Gaza is rebuilding, is fighting, obviously not just militarily, but in every other way.
Mm-hmm.
And what it looks like for the artists of Gaza is making art, and so that we can all continue to do it. So we know what genocide looks like. It's extermination physically, emotionally, mentally, societally, infrastructurally. And we know what resistance looks like. It's building all of those things back up.
And that's a very beautiful way to put it. And I think it plays into kind of what I wanted to end on, where I know there's not hands-on or direct things that most people could do abroad to kind of help with the situation, especially as long as like America and these other major nation states are enabling Israel, so to speak, or frankly. But what would your message be to people who want to help, who want to support, but don't know exactly how or what they could do?
I think everybody has to think about what exactly their capability is. For some people, they're able to do things like get involved militarily. Hey, you can go to Gaza and fight because you've got military experience and the resistance will trust you. Go fight. Like there's a genocide happening, we have to fight it in every way that we can. But the vast majority of your viewers are not going to be in that category, are not going to be capable of that. And so it consists of two things. The first thing is finding out what you can do. Everybody has a thing that they're doing, and they can do more of that thing for Gaza. For example, like you've got an audience you're speaking to, teach them about Gaza. Because the other thing too is that Gaza is the vanguard. It's it's a um, it's a watershed project. If there's liberation for Gaza, there's going to be a huge problem for imperialism everywhere. There's going to be a huge crisis, not just for imperialism, but for white supremacy. Because fundamentally, you can't explain Gaza through colonialism. Like, colonialism is an ideology that tries to take things and people. It's not a suicidal ideology, but white supremacy is a suicidal ideology because white supremacy fundamentally says that we are going to keep fighting to assert our supremacy, even if it costs us everything. That's what Israel is doing. Israel has turned functionally into a death cult. Israel as a nation is going to kill itself because it won't accept equality with Palestinians because it's so supremacist. So you talking to your audience about that, teaching them about the fundamentals, because of course Palestine didn't come up in a vacuum. And I'm Palestinian, but I never related to Palestine as a Palestinian. I related to Palestine as a peace activist. I was most interested in peace first, and then I realized the intricacies. Now I came up in the anti-globalization movement. I was interested in anti-capitalism. And guess what? It turns out that that also, is one of the bricks that will bring a lot down if we can knock it off. For people who have money, they can contribute money. Obviously, we're running a medical project. Glee is a medical project. You can maybe post some links for your
Yeah, it'll be in.
folks about how they can donate. But there are lots of other good projects if you don't like what Glee is doing. For example, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, is excellent. And they're doing good work in Gaza. UN, UNRWA, is doing good work. If somebody is really blue chip and wants like the most blue chip organization, then fine, donate to UNRWA. There are lots of good organizations doing a lot of good work. Donate. And the other thing too, so whatever people have as a skill, they should use. And the other thing I think that people should do is level up. So for me, in the war in 2008, 2009, I was still in my education. And I sat there helplessly watching. And I was so frustrated and so upset to watch the killing of so many people that I told myself, I'm going to learn whatever skills I need so that I can be more directly engaged the next time this happens. And I hate to tell you, and I hate to tell the people who might be watching this, but history does not end with the liberation of Palestine. After the liberation of Palestine, we have to rebuild Palestine. Come, join us, help rebuild. And then after that, after the liberation of Palestine, let's say it's all rainbows and unicorns, there's going to be another place and another place and another place because there's a repetition because white supremacy does not die. It gets reborn in different ways, the same way it's been over the last 500 years, even longer. And so I think the way that we have to look at it is that we're in a perpetual struggle against injustice. We're in a perpetual struggle against capital and capitalism. We're in a perpetual struggle against racism, against sexism, against white supremacy. And if we can understand that and educate ourselves, then we can construct ways of fighting it that are creative, that are new, that are wonderful. So, okay, I'll try to sum it up. Do what you can, um, donate money if that's what you can do, talk if that's what you can do, and level up so that the next time something like this happens, you're more ready to do more and contribute more.
Yeah, it just seems to be one cog in the machine that definitely needs to be broken down. I want to say again, thank you so much for taking time to join us. I appreciate you, everything you've done, your organization is doing. I will indeed have links for your organization. Some of the other ones you mentioned, I'll put in the description as well. If people are able to donate, you definitely should because it is a very good cause. They're doing life-saving work. And Doctor, again, just I appreciate everything you sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you're on Patreon or how you keep your work going, but also, we should make sure to plug that so that people can support your work and keep it going. So
Yes,
just
yeah,
go ahead, thumbs up.
I have members on YouTube, and yeah, be sure to thumbs up, like, subscribe, because I mean, this is a message that needs to reach the most amount of people it can.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for taking the time for all the work that you do.
And thank you. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.